Hello, my name is Victoria. I'm an international trade and customs consultant, and on this channel, I explore topics related to the complexities of movement of goods across borders. In line with the latest events related to Israel's and the US's attack on Iran, I believe it is important to discuss world supply chain disruptions that will inevitably follow. Thus far, we have already seen rises in oil and gas prices, and of course, panic ensue. In normal circumstances, where historical lessons are pondered, rises in prices are considered normal in face of supply shortages and general instability, which are generally regarded as temporary until conflict stabilization. Stabilization, even if violence does not decrease, is motivated by the passing of the time and a certain desensitization of the public to the events occurring in that region. Pressure generally subsides and the new news become old news. Businesses find new ways to adapt to supply chain disruptions and new procurement options appear and become more secure. In this case, however, the repercussions are feared with an extra bit of doom because the whole oil and gas world supply infrastructure will inevitably be affected. Before moving to the movement of oil and gas from the Middle East, let's remember the Russia-Ukraine conflict that was one of the major events in the last 5 years, influencing the sharp rise in prices of oil and gas that eventually resulted in continuous inflation. At the time, of course, other factors like the COVID-19 pandemic recovery were also involved in this. But from a high-level perspective, and for the purpose of this video, our primary focus will be on the oil and gas supplies. So until early 2022, Russia was one of Europe's major oil and gas suppliers, and because of the generated instability and sanctions imposed, the price of oil and gas increased and Europe sought alternative sources of energy. Important to mention here that despite Europe's rejection of Russian resources and an overall fear of its attacks on Europe itself, Russia has kept a pragmatic approach to supply of its raw materials, and even in times of war with Ukraine, would still pay Ukraine for the transit through its territory of oil and gas for Europe. Interestingly enough, both sides were bound by a 2019 ship or pay contract that expired in the end of 2024. I find it very interesting that even war would not necessarily render that contract void. But it appears that several European nations, particularly Austria, Slovakia, and Hungary, remain dependent on Russian gas, being also essentially dependent on this pipeline route through Ukraine, and therefore Ukraine allowed the transit to continue to avoid alienating these European partners who are providing vital military and financial aid alongside the other European Union members. Since this contract has not been renewed, for understandable reasons, additional destabilization of supply routes also happened through bombing of the critical infrastructure ever since. Hungary has presented its dissatisfaction and, as one of points of protest, has blocked the 90 billion aid to Ukraine. According to the EU Commission, as of early 2026, Europe's primary oil and gas sources have shifted heavily towards Norway, United States, Algeria, United Kingdom, Kazakhstan, Saudi Arabia. Norway and the US seem to be leading supplies of natural gas, while the US is the top oil supplier alongside Norway, Kazakhstan, Saudi Arabia, and the UK. Important to note that while, as of late 2025, direct imports of Russian fossil fuels into the EU have dropped drastically to roughly 3% for oil and 19% for gas, Russian oil and gas still end up on the EU market by other means. It is true that Europe has imposed sanctions on direct imports from Russia, but there are other channels through which Russian oil and gas enter European countries. These are the so-called laundromat channels. A significant portion of Russian oil still enters the EU as finalized products such as diesel and gasoline, refined in third countries like India and Turkey, bypassing direct sanctions. LNG transshipments also happen. While pipeline gas to the EU is low, the EU remains a major buyer of Russian LNG, with some of this volume being transshipped through European ports to other destinations, which means that some of the EU businesses bypass the direct sanctions by not necessarily entering that gas into the free circulation in the EU. There are also shadow fleet, which means that roughly 40% of Russian oil products in early 2025 were transported by a shadow fleet, complicating efforts to track the destination of these refined products. What sometimes happens is that in the high seas, some of the businesses may essentially just move some of the oil and gas from one ship to another. And it's very hard for customs authorities to find out all of these intricacies because not all of the movements into the EU are controlled. A lot of imports are digital, and not all of the imports come from a very detailed explanation of the origin of those resources, which essentially makes it quite difficult for customs authorities to find out what has been bought and where. This obviously only proves that illegal trade activity is an ever-present phenomenon, but also that complete control over what origin goods enter the market is impossible. Of course, it must be noted that the EU and the US became aware of these alternate channels, which led them to impose sanctions on India to ensure the imports from Russia are reduced. Now, India is the world's third largest consumer of crude oil after the United States and China. Limited domestic production capability forces India to import around 89% of its needs. Before the Russia-Ukraine conflict began in 2022, Russian oil accounted for about 2.5% of its total oil and gas purchases, increasing to about 35% by 2025. Moscow, at the time, offered discounts to Asian buyers, pricing its oil below the Brent benchmark, allowing Indian refiners to benefit by approximately $12.2 per barrel. With sanctions imposed on India, imports from Russia reduced, but these were applied only to Lukoil and Rosneft's oil and gas companies, which correspond to about half of the total oil and gas production in Russia. This means that while India started importing more oil and gas from the US, it continued balancing those purchases with its Russian procurement options, reviewing essentially the sources that were not sanctioned. Now, moving on to the current situation in the Middle East. Iran holds roughly 9% of the world's total oil reserves, ranking it amongst the top 4 globally. It also has the second largest natural gas reserves in the world. Since the beginning of the bombings, oil and gas facilities in the Gulf region were damaged, and the Strait of Hormuz have brought maritime traffic to a near standstill, halting oil and liquefied natural gas exports. In a sense, it has become pretty obvious that one of Iran's greatest leverages over global oil and gas markets comes from geography. The country borders the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow sea passage connecting the Persian Gulf to the open ocean. This route is one of the most important energy choke points on the planet. Through this single waterway pass around 20 to 21 million barrels of oil per day. That equals roughly 20% of global petroleum consumption, more than 25% of global seaborne oil trade movement, as well as about 20 to 25% of global liquefied natural gas shipments. The Strait of Hormuz generally sees exports from major producers such as Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, United Arab Emirates, and Qatar. In total, the strait carries energy supplies mainly destined for Asia, including China, India, Japan, and South Korea. Because Iran sits on the northern side of the strait and maintains strong naval and missile forces in the area, it has the ability to threaten or disrupt traffic even if it cannot permanently close it. Recent reports on Iranian activity highlight that disruptions or even mining of the strait could halt shipments of roughly one-fifth of global oil supply, immediately impacting global markets. So, in simple terms, Iran controls a strategic gateway for roughly one-fifth of the world's oil and a significant share of LNG trade, giving it an enormous geopolitical influence over global energy markets, even though it does not necessarily produce all of that share itself. In that context, we must also take into account that over the last 4 decades, Iran has been under sanctions imposed mainly by what is today known from the Russian sources as the collective West. This included the US, the EU, Israel, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and Ukraine and Switzerland in later days. Initially, the sanctions focused on freezing assets. That toolkit evolved in the 2000s and 2010s to target the core pillars of the Iranian state, its energy, banking, and shipping sectors. These measures were designed to stifle Iran's nuclear aspirations and military reach by cutting it off from the SWIFT financial network and restricting dual-use technologies. The 2018 US withdrawal from the nuclear deal and the subsequent 2025 snapback of UN sanctions acted as the final pressure points, eliminating the remaining pathways for legal trade and leaving the Iranian economy to navigate 60% inflation and a collapsing currency. Internationally, these sanctions have fundamentally reordered global energy and political alliances. To bypass Western sanctions, Iran cultivated a close relationship with Russia and China. China is currently Iran's primary customer where it comes to oil and gas supplies. At this point, we can also review the events in Venezuela, where Trump administration has captured Maduro, but it is not yet clear how Venezuelan resources will be utilized in this conflict because it is unclear whether the infrastructure can be developed fast enough and whether the Venezuelan government will actually allow for a regime change that is more favorable to the US government. Similarly, Russian president recently has mentioned that it may likely be better to get away from the European market before they are essentially kicked out and explore closer relationships to those countries that are more friendly to Russia. Now, I will try to illustrate how deeply integrated oil and gas are within nearly every single aspect of our daily life and industrial activity. The most widely recognized use of oil is in transportation. A large majority of crude oil is refined into fuels that power global mobility. Gasoline and diesel fuel the majority of cars, buses, motorcycles, delivery vehicles, and the freight trucks that move goods across continents. Aviation depends on jet fuel to operate commercial air travel and cargo transport, connecting global markets and enabling international mobility. Maritime shipping, which carries the overwhelming majority of global trade, relies on marine fuels derived from oil to power container ships, tankers, and bulk carriers. Rail systems in many regions also operate with diesel locomotives that transport both passengers and freight. In addition, specialized vehicles such as construction equipment, mining machinery, military vehicles, and agricultural equipment depend heavily on petroleum fuels to operate efficiently in demanding environments. Oil and gas are also critical sources of energy for electricity generation and heating. Natural gas is widely used in power plants to produce electricity, providing reliable energy for homes, businesses, and industries. In many parts of the world, fuel oil and natural gas are also used to generate thermal energy for industrial processes. Residential heating systems commonly rely on natural gas, heating oil, propane, or butane to maintain comfortable living conditions during cold seasons. Liquefied petroleum gases such as propane and butane are also widely used for cooking, particularly in regions without access to natural gas pipeline infrastructure. Across industrial sectors, many manufacturing processes require high temperature heat that is efficiently produced by natural gas or fuel oil. Beyond their role as fuels, oil and gas serve as the foundation of the petrochemical industry. Key petroleum-derived feedstocks such as naphtha, ethane, propane, and butane are transformed into basic chemical building blocks including ethylene, propylene, and benzene. These compounds are then used to manufacture thousands of products that are integral to modern life. Plastics and polymers are produced from these materials and are used in packaging, consumer goods, electronics, automotive components, and countless industrial applications. Synthetic fibers such as polyester, nylon, and acrylic are widely used in clothing, carpets, upholstery, and specialized technical fabrics. Synthetic rubber is another petrochemical product. It is essential for manufacturing of tires as well as seals, belts, and many other mechanical components. In the medical field, petrochemical materials are used to produce syringes, intravenous bags, protective equipment, prosthetics, and a wide variety of medical devices that support modern healthcare system. It is a lot. But this is not all. Petroleum-based compounds are also central to chemical manufacturing. Many pharmaceutical ingredients originate from petrochemical processes, contributing to the production of medicines and treatments used worldwide. Detergents and cleaning agents used in households and industry rely on petrochemical inputs. Solvents, coatings, paints, and inks are produced using petroleum derivatives and are essential in construction, manufacturing, and industrial finishing. Adhesives and sealants derived from petrochemicals are used across manufacturing, construction, and consumer goods industries. Agriculture is another sector heavily dependent on oil and gas. Natural gas is the primary feedstock for the production of ammonia, which is used to manufacture nitrogen fertilizers that support modern crop yields and global food production. Chemical compounds are used in the development of pesticides and herbicides that protect crops from pests and diseases. Agricultural machinery, such as tractors, harvesters, and irrigation systems, equally depend on petroleum fuels to operate efficiently. Petrochemical plastics also play a major role in food processing and packaging, helping preserve food, extend shelf life, and enable global food distribution systems. Infrastructure and construction also rely extensively on oil-derived materials. Asphalt and bitumen produced during oil refining are essential for building roads, highways, and airport runways. Petrochemical-based insulation materials improve the energy efficiency of buildings. Plastics, such as PVC and polyethylene, are used in pipes, fittings, and water systems. Sealants, coatings, and waterproofing materials derived from petroleum are also widely used to protect buildings and infrastructure from environmental damage. This is not all. Industrial operations and mechanical systems depend heavily on petroleum-based products as well. Lubricants and motor oils are essential for reducing friction and maintaining the performance of engines, turbines, and industrial machinery. Hydraulic fluids derived from petroleum enable the operation of heavy equipment, aircraft systems, and manufacturing machinery. Industrial waxes and greases are extensively used in manufacturing processes to improve efficiency and reliability. Even the modern digital economy depends on oil and gas. The production of computers, smartphones, networking equipment, and other electronic devices relies on plastics and specialized materials derived from petrochemicals. Semiconductor manufacturing involves complex chemical processes that depend on petroleum based materials and industrial chemicals. Data centers, which power cloud computing and artificial intelligence systems, rely on cooling fluids, lubricants, and infrastructure components that are often derived from petrochemical products, packaging, and protective materials used to transport electronic components that are also typically produced from petroleum based plastics. Oil and gas refining also produces important byproducts that are valuable for emerging technologies. One of the most significant is sulfur. Sulfur is used to produce sulfuric acid, one of the most used industrial chemicals in the world. Sulfuric acid is essential for fertilizer production, water treatment, and metal processing, such as steel and aluminium. Sulfur is also increasingly important in the development of advanced battery technologies, particularly lithium sulfur batteries, which have the potential to deliver high energy density and lower costs than many current battery technologies. In addition, sulfur based materials are being explored for innovative construction materials and specialized polymers used in advanced manufacturing. Taken together, taken together, these uses demonstrate that oil and gas are not simply energy commodities, but foundational inputs to the entire global industrial system. Transportation networks, food production, infrastructure development, manufacturing, supply chains, healthcare systems, and digital technologies all depend on stable and reliable access to these resources. Emphasis on stable and reliable. Because of the deep integration, disruptions in oil and gas supply would have consequences far beyond energy markets. Significant supply interruptions could quickly affect transportation systems, increase the cost of moving goods, disrupt manufacturing processes, and strain agricultural production. Such disruptions would ripple through supply chains and financial systems, potentially leading to widespread economic instability. Furthermore, many of the technologies associated with environmental transition also rely on materials, chemicals, and energy derived from oil and gas. Renewable energy infrastructure, advanced batteries, fertilizers for sustainable agriculture, and large scale industrial manufacturing all depend on petrochemical supply chains. At the same time, the rapid expansion of artificial intelligence and digital infrastructure requires enormous amounts of energy, materials, and industrial capacity that are currently supported by oil and gas systems. For these reasons, a sustainable disruption in the availability of oil and gas would not only challenge existing economic structures, but could also slow or undermine emerging technological ambitions, including environmental transition strategies and the continued expansion of artificial intelligence infrastructure. Stable energy supply remains a critical foundation for both current economic stability and the development of future technologies. The high stakes involved in these sectors mean that conflicts involving resource-rich nations require extensive strategic deliberation. While the entities initiating such wars may remain insulated from the immediate fallout, the repercussions inevitably funnel down to businesses, of all sizes, and ultimately it is the final consumer who bears the burden, paying the price for the widespread disruption of global supply chains and the breakdown of normal economic functioning. Where it comes to the customs side of things and import and the tariffs applicable for those imports, it is important to stress that all of the costs will in the end be passed onward to the customers, to the final buyers, be it businesses or individuals that buy semi-finished and finished products. This is because beyond the higher price of production and transportation of the goods, customs duties are applied not only onto the goods imported, which is actually not the common knowledge, but also the value of the transportation costs up to the point of import, as well as insurance, making those goods ever more expensive due to disruptions in supply chain and general instability in the world. In this sense, usually my advice to businesses I work with would be to consider short and long-term solutions to the crisis. This would imply supply chain review and mitigation strategies, consideration of alternative sourcing and procurement options, cost savings analysis to see whether there are areas where costs can be reduced or just avoid it, cut altogether. It may also be important to discuss the extra costs amongst the different stakeholders involved, meaning that it may be a good time to renegotiate pricing or transport and insurance options so as to ensure that at least some of them are absorbed by the supplier, for example. Having worked with different businesses over the years, I've noticed that it is often important for the business to retain the existing customers and to maintain the already established relationships that are safe, that are reliable, and then guarantee continuous supply of goods. And so it is often so happens that two businesses can sit down and essentially agree on who can absorb some costs just to ensure that the crisis does not halt the business activity of both those businesses and guarantees existence of them both. I would say that the same goes for the sales commission by selling and buying agents. It may as well also be an option to review, at least temporarily, the margins that businesses earn through the resale of goods, just to guarantee continuity of business. These are very tricky times, but of course, it would be naive of us to consider that times will always be the same and no changes will be introduced, especially into something so vulnerable as the world supply chains, especially considering how economic and the political landscape changes over time, how different partners become enemies and enemies somehow become friends and end up trading with each other. And so, should you have any questions, should you wish to discuss your business needs, or whether you have a compliance question, or whether there is a particular strategy that you wish to implement and just need some expert advice, please do not hesitate to contact me. I will leave my details in the description below the video. In the meantime, thank you for watching and see you next time.